Hi, Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the VPN filter malware that was reported on by Cisco as well as Symantec. Cisco's Talos group as well as Symantec both released reports on this today. It also came to light through Kevin Poulsen that over the Daily Beast that the FBI has seized the primary command and control domain used by this malware. Wanted to talk a little bit about this for our customers as well as anybody else out there. Obviously, we're making this freely available. During when these kind of reports are released, during the early hours there's always some question about what do we need to do? Are we infected? How should we deal with this, etc. And so we wanted to put some information out there, understand, not to take anything away from the reporting by Cisco and Symantec, phenomenal work there, but wanted to add a little bit of flavor there and kind of talk about stuff that we've seen and how that stuff we've seen, what we can infer from some of this, and how this is going to play out ultimately. So a couple of things. Let's start with command and control. Command and control for the malware itself, the VPNFilter malware, is basically that it goes to PhotoBucket, photobucket.com, and looks for very specific metadata in photos that have now been removed. Right, I say metadata, but data there on the basically stored on a third-party site. This is actually common. We've seen this in the past. I can roll back all the way to like circa 2010 maybe with attackers using Google Code, as a third-party site for basically for malware command and control. Right, the idea of it being an image, even if we roll back to the DNC hack, there was malware there that was using Britney Spears' Instagram account for command and control. So comments posted there. Right, so this isn't new. We've also seen malware using metadata inside of an image for command and control. Again, there's nothing really new here specifically. There's also a domain, I believe, toknowall.com that was seized by the FBI. So the malware goes to PhotoBucket first. And then comes back and tries to go to this toknowall.com to basically as a backup there. As far as command and control, the command and control here is actually pretty critical when it comes down to it. The malware, the VPNFilter malware, it doesn't have most of the functionality on the router that's been exploited. Right, so basically what's happening here is the attackers are using a modular framework, which implies a higher level of sophistication. Right, so modular framework, and as we take a look there, we note that they only persist across reboots at the very low level of the malware, meaning that it really doesn't do much except beacon out, and when it beacons out, then it'll pull down that configuration. As well as any additional modules configured. Now, what's really interesting here is because it's modular, there are likely modules, and Cisco assesses with high confidence. Again, I don't know what they base that high confidence on specifically, although I tend to believe they're correct. They've only seen a couple of modules in the wild. It's likely that there are multiple additional modules that they haven't yet seen because they haven't been yet tasked. Now, what the FBI has seen, what DHS has seen, is likely far higher or far larger number of those modules. We just haven't seen those yet. Based on Talos's observation. I'll tell you, for our Security Operations Center customers, we've been going back and scrubbing our data now that we know about, again, this PhotoBucket, the specific PhotoBucket buckets, I guess, or counts the data was stored under, as well as the toknowall.com domain. And again, we just don't have anything there. So I can share then, we've already, again, as we come back around on this, we don't have anything there to contribute from a reporting standpoint. But maybe that kind of points to, again, the fact that largely these are Soho customers and very small businesses that are likely to use this equipment and expose these Soho class routers, TP-Link. I believe we saw TP-Link, I believe Linksys. Let's see. We know Microtech. We know that there are QNAP devices, and let's see, what were the other devices? It was Netgear, Microtech, Linksys, and TP-Link. And again, QNAP, network attached storage devices. Again, these are generally Soho style devices. Even from a QNAP perspective, while there are enterprise grade QNAPs, the odds that you have one of those exposed directly to the internet to be exploited seems reasonably lower when you're in the enterprise class space. So QNAP, just like Linksys and D-Link, honestly, have both consumer grade and enterprise grade, or at least lower level enterprise grade equipment. So anyway. So what we're looking at here, as far as from a risk perspective, right? Understand, of course, that once the attackers control your router, they control, again, in most cases, this is both a firewall and a gateway. And in most cases, again, we're talking about here, DNS. In many cases, your router is, or in most cases, for these Soho type deployments, your router is your DNS server. While we haven't seen any evidence yet that there was a DNS spoofing or DNS interception capability, we know that that's definitely possible from that position, whether you use that as your DNS server or not. Right? Even if you had a dedicated DNS server in the network, as it calls out to your upstream DNS providers, you're going to see then, or the attacker is in position to see that query ID, and again would be in a position to to spoof the response regardless, right? So I think it's important to understand that the attacker at this point has full man-in-the-middle capability. Of course, that's noted by the fact that they have the router in the first place. But separate from that, one of the easiest ways to, and we do this all the time in pen tests, again, is to ultimately control DNS, right? So rather than using natting or some other method to GRE tunnels, for instance, to redirect the user, simply changing DNS basically will fix that, right? Meaning we only intercept specific requests of interest and redirect those to a location of our choosing, right? So think about all the unsecured updates that occur, all that. Again, this seems pretty scary. I say pretty scary. Again, typically these are SMBs, so we're not talking about large enterprises generally, although some enterprises that we work with today have some pretty small remote offices, as well as, in some cases, have work-from-home employees that they will, issue specific equipment to. I know that some of our customers in the past have used Linksys and as well as Linksys devices, as well as some of the other devices on the list, right? So Linksys, certainly Netgear devices. Linksys probably being a little bit more common. Okay, so where are we at, right? From a second stage malware perspective, the modules that they've seen involve packet capture, as well as the ability to go in and communicate over Tor. Look, attackers generally don't develop capabilities. We talk about this a lot in threat intelligence when we think about a threat being an intersection between intent, opportunity, and capability, right? So you think about IOC, intent, opportunity, and capability. Attackers only generate capabilities for which they have an actual need. Now, they may deploy those in other locations, but we found generally attackers are building tools to satisfy a requirement, right? And when I think about what's the functional requirement for Tor, here I start thinking nation state, right? Now, I know in the past we've seen the Mirai botnet, and the Mirai botnet actually was the original version, at least, of the Mirai botnet, was done, believe it or not, for gamers, right? So for gamers that wanted to basically sell access to their premium gaming servers, again, that's a little bit underwhelming. Here, you step back and you say, okay, Tor, why do they need to speak Tor? Well, look, at the point that you're at the router, honestly, at this point, you're past the point where most Sohos, anybody that would have exposed this stuff to the internet, you're beyond the point where they have where they would have any monitoring, right? In fact, these organizations probably have little to no monitoring at all. We do monitor, by the way, a number of SMBs, and I'll tell you that depending on the deployment, a lot of the monitoring goes inside the router, right? This is a spot where we're looking to change. Now, we've talked to folks about visibility that they get internal versus external. Of course, we offer both before and after a router, and obviously we disable remote management on any of our customer routers. By the way, remote management, which is off by default on most devices, is in most cases how folks are getting into these, right? The exploits exploits that have been observed. And this report from Talos, or these reports from Talos and Symantec, line up very well with the earlier DHS reports that Russians were specifically trying to target routers. Again, the specific vendors line up pretty well, and so do the details that we know up to this point. Right? Okay, so as far as Tor goes, I kind of step back and I say, look, it's not the monitoring that they're worried about. It's not local monitoring they're worried about. I think the reason that we see the Tor piece developed, I would bet, is that you're looking at a nation state. They believed, second, that at some point law enforcement or someone with privileged access to the ISP would be, or ISPs in a given nation would begin looking at that level, right? So I think that as you look at that, you're looking at, they're not necessarily worried about the monitoring. They are very worried about somebody targeting them at an ISP level, and that's where Tor then becomes interesting, right? Now, I'm kind of interested there, from an IOC perspective, it's great to say go look for Tor on your network and block Tor usage, but again, at this point, they're already in the router, right? So even if you had the router configured somehow, to block access by IP address to a Tor node, again, bear in mind the attackers are below below the point where that's where that's in play, and could easily change any of those settings at will anyway. So most of these routers are simply Linux and run an IP tables command under the hood, and again, the attackers could simply reverse that. And again, blocking all Tor entry nodes at the Soho level is probably undoable. Anyway, again, I would intune this is not a stealth measure for the victims. I would intune that it is a stealth measure for law enforcement, right? Very specifically, I would mention that the Tor module does not persist across reboots. And so no matter what, you would see the command connection to the command and control connection to PhotoBucket and or to the toknowall.com domain, which has since been seized by the FBI. We would see, you would still see that connection out. It would then download the Tor module and then begin using Tor, right? So again, this doesn't make sense from a we don't want to track. And again, they didn't make that module persistent. Again, what does that imply? Was that a developer problem? Meaning, like, again, it would have taken additional developer cycles. Is it a we don't want to? Again, I'm not entirely certain. But again, from a tracking perspective, the Tor module doesn't prevent law enforcement, presuming law enforcement has ISP access. It doesn't prevent law enforcement from knowing specifically who's infected. What it does do is blocks them from understanding, basically from understanding the command and control that happens after that, right? Because again, at this point, you're talking on the Tor network, and if you've ever done any investigations using Tor, even if you have ISP level access, again, this is phenomenally difficult, right? So again, everything is encrypted, all that good stuff. So what about the other module that's been discovered? The other stage 2 module that's been discovered? It's a packet capture module, and this is what concerns me a little bit more. The packet capture module specifically was looking for two things. Although again, want to mention that it is just great. I mean, it is doing packet capture, but specifically is pulling out credentials for HTTP-based authentication. I think that's kind of interesting. Meh, okay, but really the big one here is Modbus. And if you're not familiar with Modbus, this is a SCADA protocol, supervisory control and data acquisition. We see these a lot in industrial networks. Very often when you hear about people hacking the grid, they're talking about doing things on these industrial control systems and SCADA networks. And here Modbus is a very specific protocol that's used on these SCADA networks. And the fact that it is pulling out specific SCADA command IDs that are being used, basically you would use these command IDs to understand, and parameters to understand what type of devices are on a given network. Right? Now, again, the fact that you have this being snarfed up by this router, by this module, tells you that there's a specific interest, right? Specific interest in these SCADA networks. Now, look, your average Joe trying to steal stuff, right? When we start talking about the 3 pillars of security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When we talk about our average Joe trying to steal something, steal data, my credit card number, my PII, whatever here, that's the confidentiality tier, right? Look, there's no reason to go track Modbus data to target confidentiality. If you want to target integrity and availability, on the other hand, if, for instance, you wanted to turn the lights out, for instance, just speaking hypothetically here, let's say in Ukraine, this would be a great thing to understand. Where do you have where do you have these Modbus, or where do you have devices talking this Modbus protocol? Again, generally these are going to be industrial control system devices, and so what I see here is two things, right? I see from an HTTP credential standpoint, you have this credential snarfing, and again, there's no evidence, at least based on what Talos released, that there's any SSL interception. Again, although anybody operating at this level, developing malware at this level, is almost certainly, they almost certainly had the capability. They've almost certainly deployed it in choice networks. Again, it just comes down to for Talos or anybody else to even study this. And again, this becomes impossible today. But for anybody in the commercial space to study this, again, you would have had to have set up a target that got exploited by the Russians. And again, I'm capitulating that I believe this probably is the Russians, but I would say with moderate confidence, right? There are some other folks reporting with high confidence. Kevin Poulsen from Daily Beast seems to be reporting with high confidence. I'm going to come back and say with moderate confidence, I would assess that it's the Russians based on a lot of overlap in TTPs. The Talos report also notes that some of the malware, particularly for the x86 platform, by the way, notice this has been written for x86 and MIPS, but for the x86 platform specifically, when we talk about the x86 platform, it shares a lot of code with, or some of the code with Black Energy. Now, again, I kind of come back and note that Black Energy has been sold a couple of times. The source code's kind of been leaked, and that's where I start getting into the whole moderate confidence. And again, it's so widely attributed to Russia that if I were going to false flag something, I might start from a point of the Black Energy source and any other reverse engineering I've done around Black Energy. So the fact that I see the code overlap there helps me a little bit. The fact that the FBI and DHS and NKIC have previously, seemingly attributed this router activity that we don't know lines up 100% with this, but they've attributed that to the Russians. I kind of come back and I'm putting preponderance of the evidence together, and I'll say moderate confidence. It's probably Russia. Again, we saw Talos reports a very, very heavy concentration in Ukraine. That would be consistent with previous attacks in Russia. Again, the targeting Modbus again is very very typical of what we've seen already from different Russian attack groups. You probably remember Crash Override, which explicitly talks Modbus, and so again, if you're looking here at people that have these capabilities or groups that have these capabilities, Russia pretty much lines up. So from this perspective, I look at these stage 2 modules as as something that you're basically used for data, basically data theft here. But more importantly, it's not just about stealing the credentials. It's not just about stealing the Modbus commands. Really, these are survey modules. And Poulsen's article, which I'll have linked down here, by the way, I'll have all the articles that we have linked on this. Poulsen's article notes that that there's about 500,000, I'm sure this number came from the FBI, but 500,000 devices that were infected. I have no doubt that, or have little doubt that the FBI and NKIC probably have looked at other modules that Talos hasn't seen. I think whatever we've seen to date is all we're going to see. It's exceedingly difficult to look at these modules because, of course, when the router reboots, your stage 2 modules go away. Right? They're non-persistent, right? Only that stage 1, the piece that calls out to the command and control, is persistent. So as I look at my stage 2 modules, there's really only 2 purposes there, right? The Tor module, I think, is there to evade law enforcement. And then on the flip side, the Modbus, or the packet capture module, the fact, if it was just a packet capture module, I wouldn't be making such a big leap here to say it was a survey tool. It could actually be a data theft tool. But one of the things that tells us it's a survey tool is the fact that they're extracting credentials from HTTP. Again, the credentials, they're not interested in looking for specific data patterns like track2 or things that match credit card regexes that do credit card numbers. None of that. Right? They're looking specifically for HTTP authentication and then Modbus. And again, there's a really limited number of people who care about that kind of thing. And it's not your script kiddies, and it's not your hacktivists, generally not your hacktivists. And again, I'm coming back here and I'm looking nation state, and I say nation state specifically because of the Modbus piece. Right? So anyway, look, what do you need to do if you were infected here? Right? I think you have to step back. I think you got a couple of choices, right? You know, obviously, same advice that everybody else has given up to this point, right? Which is the basically go in and definitely you want to do a basically start with a reboot of your router, right? I think that's a good start, right? Followed up with a full factory reset of the router, right? So the most routers today, you know, have your dual flash bays effectively, where you know you've got a running flash and you've got a stored flash, and the pressing the little paperclip button in the back with a factory reset is in many cases is gonna reflash that device. So. Some don't. Bottom line, factory reset is likely to take care of this. I probably update your firmware too, because that's probably a good idea. Well, not probably. Updating your firmware in 99.9% of cases is the right move. Any passwords that you had on the device, right? So if you had VPN configured, I'd want to rotate this stuff out, right? Likewise, your Wi-Fi password, I'd like to rotate that out. There's no evidence that you know, that the Russians or whoever the attacker was, that they stole your router configurations. But let me step back and ask, why wouldn't they? Right? Picture that this is a nation state, and I think again the Modbus makes a pretty good case for that. If it's a nation state, they undoubtedly you know, have spies, human assets, right, in different locations. And again, if they can steal your Wi-Fi password, that gives them all kinds of ways to do plausibly deniable, you know, routing out of a given country, right? Just like DHS warned, they could have done attacks from these platforms. They can also, you know, do the same thing for data exfiltration using your internet rather than them buying their own internet. I kind of look at that and I think, yeah, again, I can't imagine why they wouldn't have extracted that data. Again, although, caveat, we have no evidence that they did. Best practices say you had an attacker on the device, you should absolutely update those passwords, right? So rotate those out. I think a good follow-up here, right, as we're talking about follow-ups, I think a big one that we have to look at and we have to say, yeah, this makes sense, we should do this. You know, I think one of the things that you have to take a look at doing is threat hunting in your own environment. Now, I know this one's a little bit of a weird suggestion because in a lot of cases, again, we expect these devices to be in organizations that generally are on the lower end of the spending spectrum and probably lower end of the sophistication spectrum. And so, you know, I realize I'm giving advice here where most people don't have the resources to do that, right? So I want to threat hunt in my environment, understanding that again, you know, if I were infected or thought we were conceivably infected, you know, so that would be something I would recommend, knowing that you know, most are not going to do that, right? What I will say is that if you use one of these devices, it had remote management enabled, and you know, you believe that you may have been infected, this may be a spot where you want to actually let's back up, right? If you use one of these devices, you had remote management enabled. Let's start by assuming you probably were infected. I think that's reasonable at this point. You know, what do you do from here? Do you reboot it? If you reboot it, of course, we know we lose forensic evidence, right? You're going to lose any of the stage 2 plugins that are there. Now, again, bear in mind, you'll never get those back down again because the FBI is now taking control of the backup command, the toknowall.com, which is their backup C2 server. PhotoBucket's no longer serving that. And again, this is one of the reasons, you know, I kind of mentioned before, we're not going to see any of the new modules. FBI, DHS, whoever may already have some of those. From a commercial standpoint, we've got what we got, right? So, you know, as we look here, I think it's important to know, you know, from a forensic standpoint, if you reboot the router and or return it to flash, you're losing the ability to do that follow-up forensics. Did they task, you know, my router with a stage 2 module? You reboot it, we don't know, right? Unless you have other monitoring in play. And again, I'm capitulating that in most cases that's just not the way it's working, right? Given these class of devices. So if you reboot the stuff, you just don't know. You restore it to factory, you're set, but again, you're losing forensic evidence, right? So there's a lot of give and take here, right? Your quick win on security, reset everything, factory reset, you know, update the firmware, all that stuff, right? Now, again, do you do threat hunting in your environment? There's no question that an attacker with man-in-the-middle position has the ability to absolutely attack you, target your network. There's no question there, and they're going to be successful in almost every case, given enough time, right? So, I guess what I would say here is that if you know you had Modbus or industrial control system devices, or if you know that you were infected for any number of reasons, and you believe that you believe that an attacker would have found your network interesting, because again, they've got the survey module there for packet capture. Whether they were looking for other things besides Modbus is unknown. Whether there are other survey modules is also unknown. I would say likely, but specifically if you have Modbus, that's the one TTP or the one intent piece that I would kind of focus back to, intent to compromise Modbus, right? The plain text password thing or the HTTP based passwords and authentication there, we believe would be to go expand access would be the intent, right? So I guess then what we'll kind of come back to is, okay, we know this stuff was out there. What do we do now? Are we really going to threat hunt in the environment? Again, we recommend it, but again, I don't. I understand that again, the folks most likely to threat hunt are also not the folks most likely to have been infected with this in the first place, right? So best practices: we want to reset those routers. We want to reset back to default configs or factory config. We then want to go back in and we want to go change our passwords, because we want to assume that, again, whoever is on the router has pulled down whatever our Wi-Fi password was, any VPN passwords or private keys that we had installed. We want to go ahead and rotate all that stuff out, right? Again, some of these Soho grade routers did have some VPN features, and then again, from that perspective, internally, we definitely want to make sure that that we do any threat hunting. Particularly if we have any Modbus looking for infected hosts, right? I'll mention that if you're in that Soho small office or SMB kind of area there, dedicated monitoring and 24/7 SOC is getting cheaper than you would have ever imagined before. Talk to us if you want to hear some of the prices. But again, it's well within range for most small businesses that are looking to increase their security and don't have any dedicated IT or security admin staff, right? So it's not what it was a few years ago. Look, that said, is this a hair on fire kind of moment? I don't know. I mean, I think we've kind of dodged the bullet here. Again, FBI seized control of the domain. We're not going to see widespread denial of service attacks, although that could well have happened with 500,000 devices in play. We're not going to see that now, right? I think now the real concerns are, what do the Russians have available, right? And how are they going to go update some of these devices? Because again, I have no doubt that they can go back and re-exploit many of the devices that were exploited previously. I have no doubt that in the coming days or weeks, if it's not already happening, some of those devices will be reinfected with other stage 1 malware, and this game is going to begin again, right? Again, that stage 1 malware at this point, it's not like traditional Windows malware where they have to go rewrite it to evade an antivirus signature. They don't have to worry about that, right? It literally comes down to just, is remote management still enabled? If yes, and router vulnerable, go knock it over, install brand new stage 1 malware with different C2 servers, right? Again, your router's not running antivirus to be able to go find this thing in the first place. And again, just know that once the attackers have that, of course, they can shut down your internet access or man in the middle. Of course, data theft is an obvious concern there. My biggest concern, though, is what are they targeting internally, right? These routers, largely in QNAP network attached storage devices, these are not the end goal. They're a means to an end, right? So know that, right? Now, look, they exploited, I'm sure, in this carpet bomb the internet kind of thing where they hit 500,000 routers. I'm sure they hit stuff that wasn't interesting or wasn't specifically interesting. Great. Cool or interesting to them, and then they'll hold on to that access to use it as one of basically a bot in a bot army for a distributed denial of service attack, right? So again, if you want to even break that 500,000 victims down, there are some that are really interesting. There's some that aren't. They could be used to, like, if you wanted to go shut off or cause some chaos in a country. Let's say they were targeting Ukraine again, or rolling into Georgia, right? Let's say, like we've seen happen before. Georgia the country, not Georgia the state, for those down-home folks who don't know the difference. Hope that's not anybody here. But anyway, rolling into Georgia, they could well shut off the internet for any of these infected devices, right? And of course, that would itself, break down communications. Again, that's part of what militaries go to do during an invasion or during during an event. So so again, I would mention that capability was there. It's not there now for this specific malware. Give it time, and again, these folks are going to retool. They may already be doing so. I'm sure DHS and FBI know more about that than we do. Look, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here, but just wanted to kind of bring ground truth back to what is this what is this VPN? What is this? Is your VPN filter malware? Do you need to be concerned? Again, if you're a large enterprise, probably not, unless you use these with remote workers, these devices with remote workers, or at some of your smaller remote offices. I think if you're a larger enterprise, your bigger concern is supply chain, right? So who in your supply chain is infected? Again, supply chain attacks are not unheard of. They are definitely in the scope of Russian operations. That's how NotPetya started, was a software supply chain attack, right? So again, I can't obviously talk about who the victims are because we don't know. We don't know if the FBI is going to be notifying the victims either. We know they've done some surgical victim notification, meaning like they've said, hey, you specifically are infected. We've heard some back channel reports of that. But specifically, do we know, are they notifying all of the 500,000 victims or even all of the victims in the U.S.? That certainly doesn't seem likely, and we don't have any information on that yet, right? So some more to follow there, right? But basically, again, if you're a large enterprise, my big concern is supply chain management. If you are a smaller organization, talk to us if you're interested in doing some security evaluation, whether that's threat hunting or getting some monitoring in play. I would note that if you have monitoring in play, we're eventually going to see, again, adverse actions by the adversary. They have to talk out on the network, right? So anyway, with that, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off. Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec, signing off. Enjoy.